Thank you, Miguel. We have to move quickly to question period right now. People that are interested in various subjects can talk to Dan. We'd have a brief fundraising pitch as well to cover today's expenses.
Hello, brothers and sisters. I'm here to make a fundraising pitch and to introduce you, to people who haven't yet seen it, to our new fundraising hat. Passing the hat has a new meaning now. So, this hat has our initials on it, HCSW, Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. It has a peace sign, it has a button that says "Don't Bomb Syria," and best of all, it has a big copious area for your paper currency and coinage. So I'd like you to dig deeply into your pockets at this particular moment, and I will come around and help you empty them.
Okay, keep up the money.
And so please dig deeply and help us with the cost of Dan's trip and for the meeting tonight. Thank you.
We also take checks. Just because we have an event right here tomorrow, there's a little announcement here. Robert has to tell you about the film that's happening that you can easily get to. So, Robert, thank you.
Tomorrow night, the Hamilton 2019 Voices of Palestine film series continues with the Wanted 18. In Beit Sahur, some Palestinians, they go out and they buy 18 cows. They bring them to the village to produce milk and cheese. The Israelis find out about it. It's declared a national security risk. And wonderful film, NFB film. Please come out and support the film series. Yes, thanks.
That's tomorrow. Please do check out the Jewish Liberation Theology Institute, JELITHIN.ca, for information about the Hamilton Palestine Film Festival. That particular film is a touching film. I believe it also contains some cartoon segments. It's a very amusing film that you can take your friends to see, your family. It's for people that may not know a lot about the issue, but it's very amusing. So we do have our question and answer period. It's this voluntary session, and Dan, of course, has written, as you know, this whole book on the U.S. plot to control the world. He spoke largely about Venezuela today as a subsection of that. But if you want to ask about Venezuela, or you want to ask about the larger things that are going on, about the U.S. management of Saudi Arabia and oil prices and things like that, of course, Dan can speak on those subjects and other issues. And of course, about alternative media, where you can find more information about these things, whether they be documentaries, like The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, or some of the websites that Dan writes for. So we do have some ground rules for how it works. Of course, there might be differences of opinion on the question of Venezuela and other things. So people are invited to make comments or ask questions. We just ask that you identify yourself by your name or affiliation, and keep it to 2 minutes or less, please. We don't have time for whole speeches, but if you have some comments and certainly your questions, we can take that. We can't do crosstalk back and forth because we have to give everyone a chance to ask questions, so we're going to take one person at a time. So I guess I'll just pick people that they raise their hand, and Dan will be at the microphone and he can answer questions. Yes?
Dan, could you take a moment to talk about the Lehman Group versus the OAS and the role of Canada in all of the situation in Venezuela?
Yes, so there was, thank you for, that's a great question. So the OAS, of course, the Organization of American States, is the regional international law group in the Western Hemisphere. So you have, of course, the UN under the UN Charter, but the UN Charter allows regional groups as well to help manage issues of human rights, democracy, other things within their regions. The OAS, as many of you know, has existed, I believe, since the 50s to ostensibly do that, though I will say that it's oftentimes acted as really a pawn of the United States. But in any case, it is the official legal grouping of countries in the Western Hemisphere. I think everyone but Cuba, which was kicked out shortly after the revolution. But the OAS, there was a move in the OAS to try to recognize Guaido as the president of Venezuela. That failed. So at the moment, the OAS recognizes Nicolas Maduro as the proper president. Venezuela, as does the United Nations itself. And so what the U.S. and Canada have done is assemble what George W. Bush once called the Coalition of the Willing, which is a number of right-wing governments in Latin America to help move along this regime change operation in Venezuela. And of course, Canada hosted the Lima group here recently, in Ottawa, I guess? Yes. And so this is, again, a group with no legal status, let's be clear. It's a group, a manufactured grouping to try to push this regime change operation. But those with legal authority, the OAS and United Nations recognize Nicolas Maduro as the president. Yes?
Hi, my name is John Luke, and I saw in the news when the Russians flew those 2 bombers over to Venezuela in clear support, both militarily and economically, of the Venezuelan elected government. And I was wondering, if we get what amounts to Vietnam 2.0 in Venezuela, do you think the Russians will directly intervene?
Well, I think the Russians are acting more as a deterrent. I think they would like to, by their presence, which a fairly meager presence, deter any type of intervention. But I don't see them as intervening in the sense of firing against the United States if it invades, for example. I don't think the Russians would do that. The Russians have been fairly, if I might say, practical and restrained in terms of those things. I mean, even with, if you recall the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, we did come close to nuclear war, but really it was the Russians that backed down and just left Cuba, and actually against the wishes of Fidel. So I don't see them intervening in any type of military fashion, except, again, as possibly a deterrent. But I do think it's worth pointing out that the U.S., through this maneuver with Venezuela, through its maneuvers in Ukraine, in Syria, certainly the U.S., in my view, is certainly risking the possibility of some sort of confrontation with Russia. And of course, Trump, as you know, just backed out of the Intermediate Nuclear Range Missile Treaty of 1987, which makes the use of nuclear weapons much more likely. So I think, we need to be concerned, of this, of moves that could lead to some sort of world conflagration. Yes?
Yeah, Henry Evans, Kendrick, Coalition to Stop the War. As you're aware, recently there was a meeting in Europe which was hijacked by Bolton and Pompeo and Netanyahu. And their aim was to foment war against Iran. Do you know anything about that?
Yes. Well, first of all, my second book is called The Plot to Attack Iran, and it's all about that issue. I urge you to go purchase that. Yes, I mean, first of all, and I was reminded of this by Miguel on our drive up here, it's been known for some time there was this project for a new American century that was put together in the 90s by the neocons, in which they made it clear they had a plan, and this is before 9/11, they had a plan to remake the Middle East by attacking 7 different countries, beginning with Iraq and ending with Iran. And there is no doubt that Iran is on the short list to be attacked. John Bolton has been very clear. Actually, he said he did not even want the Iranians to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the ousting of the Shah. Well, he didn't get that because that was just celebrated this month. But the point is, the U.S. and a number of very important people, again, like Bolton, who is the National Security Advisor, have threatened military operations against Iran. The U.S. has also been working with, and people like Bolton and others, Mike Pompeo, and even some Democrats, have actually gone to meetings of the MEK, which was a designated terrorist group up till 2012, which has killed at least 17,000 Iranians in Iran, an anti-regime terrorist group where the U.S. is openly working with them. So there is definitely a goal afoot for regime change in Iran. There are very serious sanctions that have been imposed against Iran illegally, which have been very devastating to their economy. The hope is that the sanctions might lead to regime change there. But I do think a military attack is possible. Now, I think that plan has been slowed because of the failures in Syria, where it looks like the regime change plans there have not worked. And also, you know, Iran is a very formidable country. It's a country of 80 million people. As retired Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who actually wrote the Yellow Cake speech for Colin Powell, which helped pave the way for the Iraq War, has said, and by the way, he regrets that. He says that he regrets that and he does not want another war like that in Iran. As he estimates, a war with Iran will be 10 to 15 times more costly in terms of lives and treasure than the war in Iraq. I mean, you're talking about a major conflict. So God help us if there would be a military invasion of Iran. But again, the U.S. has never, let's just be clear, has never forgiven Iran for overthrowing the Shah in 1979. That the U.S. installed, for those maybe too young to remember, the U.S. installed the Shah in 1953, overthrew a democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, because he nationalized Iranian oil fields, and installed the Shah and set up the Savak. The CIA helped set up the Savak, their internal security force, which ruled through torture and murder throughout the reign of the Shah. In 1978, by the way, before the overthrow of the Shah, Amnesty International said that Shah's Iran had the worst human rights record on earth. And the U.S. has never forgiven the Iranians for tossing the Shah. So they have had designs on actually bringing the Shah's son back. That's the goal. He lives in Paris with his mom, and the goal is to reinstall the Shah. Yeah. Yes.
I wanted to ask you about the 40 clandestine flights that have taken place into Venezuela over the last week, I believe.
Yeah, well, there have been. There's certainly. Well, I guess I don't know about all 40. I do know that there have been some caches of arms that have been discovered being brought into Venezuela. I mean, clearly, there is an operation afoot to try to stir something up. I mean, what the U.S. ideally wants, and again, it's not a secret. The U.S. has been very openly courting and encouraging a military coup in Venezuela. That is what they would like. The U.S. would prefer not to have to go into Venezuela because U.S. troops in Latin America in 2019 are not good optics. There will be a major response to that. In fact, I understand that there are already international brigades heading to Venezuela to defend the revolution from all around the world, the Che Guevara Brigade. So the U.S. has openly been calling for a military coup. And I'm sure weapons are being sent to try to bring that about. Yes?
Can you speak to the fact that it seems like, perhaps with the dying empire, it seems that as Russia and China invest more in the third world, Latin America and Africa, it seems to be making America a little antsy. And they seem to wait for the investment to take place and for things to start gelling, and then they start putting their boot down. Is this what's happening? Is this a model for going forward?
Well, I think that's exactly part of what's happening here. And again, one can just go back to the Monroe Doctrine from 1823. I mean, the U.S. has made it clear through the Monroe Doctrine, and that is still in force, that it is the preeminent country in the Western Hemisphere, sorry, Canada, and that it only may exert its influence in Latin America, which it deems its backyard. And so, of course, the Monroe Doctrine came about because the U.S. was trying to make it clear to Europe that they didn't want them involved in Latin America. And certainly now we don't want the Chinese or Russians involved. And that's very much what's happening now, is that because China is investing in Latin America and Russia is relating to some of these countries, one of the reasons they want to overthrow a government like that in Venezuela is because it's friendly with those countries. Now, of course, the huge irony is that it's U.S. sanctions that is pushing countries like Venezuela into the hands of the Chinese and Russians, right? I mean, what else are they supposed to do? If they can't trade here and they can't trade on the U.S. dollar, they're going to trade on someone else's currency, and they're going to trade with other people. But that's always been the game plan, right? And during the first Cold War, again, as Chomsky would point out, if you had a government, a revolutionary government, even if it didn't have a relationship with the Soviet Union, the U.S. would force them into a relationship with the Soviet Union and then scold them for having a relationship with the Soviet Union and use that as a pretext to invade. And that's exactly, you're seeing that dynamic. So you're exactly right, that's part of what's happening here. Yes?
Can you speak a little bit about the situation in Nicaragua and the Sandinistas?
Yes, well, and I think that is one of the most misunderstood, well, because it's one of the greatest lies ever told, is what happened this summer. I was there this summer following things very close. I was back a couple weeks there, and I'll be back in April. Actually, I'm working on a documentary film with a film cinematographer from Montreal. What happened in Nicaragua over the summer was pure and simple a U.S. Orchestrated attempt at regime change. And you don't have to take my word for it. The regime change arm of the United States, the National Endowment for Democracy, the Reagan-era organization, which became the regime change arm, taking over for the CIA, bragged about the fact, in its words, that it laid the groundwork for the insurrection that took place over the summer. Before what happened over the summer, Ortega had an 80% approval rating, and his police were considered some of the best police in the hemisphere in terms of their community policing, peaceful way of dealing with criminal issues, particularly with youth. And now all of a sudden we're to believe that they turned on their own people and started killing them. It never happened. We were told there was a student massacre. It never happened. In fact, the first person killed in April was a police officer by the nonviolent opposition. 22 police officers were killed over the summer. Some, and I've seen photos and videos of this, some with their limbs cut off, heads cut off. It was brutal. This was not a peaceful protest. This was a violent attempt not only to overthrow the government, but to destroy Sandinissimo. Sandinistas' houses were marked so that people would go and kill those people. And about 50 Sandinistas were murdered during this period. It was an incredible thing that happened, and I know that most people have been led to believe that somehow it was the government that did all this, and it's not true. In fact, the opposition, or the violent parts of the opposition, literally burned portions of Nicaragua to the ground. Burned down a UNESCO historic site in Leon, burned down mayor's offices, burned down radio stations, credit unions. This was the opposition people were supporting, even leftists. It was incredible. This was a Contra-type activity that was happening in a number of different cities all at once and all on the same day. It clearly was orchestrated. And by the time I got there, I was there for July 19th, which was as you know, July 19th is the anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution. Again, just to remind people, of course, the day that the Sandinistas overthrew the U.S.-backed dictator Anastasio Somoza, who had killed 50,000 people during the insurrection, okay? with the U.S. supporting him to the bitter end, even as he was bombing his own people, Managua. Again, when I hear about the U.S. doing things for democracy in Nicaragua or other places, I mean, I don't know whether to laugh or cry. But in any case, so July 19th is their big year. It's their Independence Day. So this year, whether people showed up and how many people showed up was going to be a litmus test for where the people were in terms of supporting or not supporting the government. And they had record crowds out to hear Daniel Ortega speak. I was there in the square, waving the red and black flags, families, kids. It was incredible. And by the end, people realized what had happened. It took a while to realize what happened. But people were relieved that this coup was put down. And life has largely returned to normal, though the wounds, left by what happened will take a long time to repair. Up until this point, I'll just note that when Ortega was reelected in 2006, took office in 2007. Since that time, every year, the economy of Nicaragua grew by 5%. He reduced poverty by 40%. He made Nicaragua one of the most stable, peaceful countries in Latin America. It's the only country who experienced the war of the 80s in Central America that is not sending migrants to the border. And in a very short period of time, the U.S. stirred up things to destroy that stability, to destroy the economy. And it's heartbreaking. And they're trying to come back from that. But it's going to take a long time. Tourism has been hurt. It's incredible. But I urge people to go to Nicaragua vacation there. They need your money. Yes.
Yes, how are you, Mr. Dan?
Mm-hmm.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
And I've been always following a lot of your work, and I really appreciate it. So, we'll have to give you a clap for about that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
To spread awareness and understanding of what really is going on in world affairs, people need to more be active, standing against illegal human rights violations, illegal wars. You know what I mean? Plundering of people's resources happening on a high level. It's spreading everywhere in a lot of places in the world, and there's more threats to more destabilization in the world, and then more refugees will be flooded all over the world, and then we'll have more problems, right?
Yes.
Particularly, my name is Faraz Al-Najib, and I'm a manager for a human rights organization here in Canada called Canadian Defenders for Human Rights. And one main topic we always work on and cause is Yemen. I'm not originally from Yemen. I've never been to Yemen. I've never married.
I'm glad you mentioned Yemen. Yes.
Yeah. So Yemen is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world.
Yes.
And pretty much we see a lot of mainstream media neglecting this situation overall, right? We're going into the 4th year anniversary. Okay. And you see as Saudi Arabia with their coalition and their mercenaries have been fighting there for over 4 years in Yemen, and they're in a quagmire, I guess they call it, like they're stuck in a place where they don't know what to do anymore. So what do you think the outcome is going to be, and if you can give us any other insight and information that you know about the Yemen conflict. And then after you're done, I would like to, or maybe I can just announce now that we have an annual protest marking the illegal Saudi war. It's March 26th, that's when the war started. So we do that every year. We leave from all different cities and we go to Ottawa. So we start at Global Affairs Canada, and then we end off at Parliament Hill. So I will give all my business cards to everybody with my phone number, and then people can message me or email me or so on like that. Okay,
right.
You can go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad you brought up Yemen, and I actually usually start with Yemen because, again, I do think it is instructive that we don't hear much about Yemen. And when, as you say, it is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, not just today, but potentially in the last 100 years. I've seen estimates that 12, maybe 21 million people could starve in Yemen because of this crisis. I mean, you're talking about a massive Holocaustal number of people. And of course, the importance of it is that it is happening with the help of the U.S. and Canada, who are funding this war, that are providing arms to the Saudis and you can't even call it a war. It's more of a turkey shoot. I mean, the Saudis are just destroying this country. They're destroying, again, incredible historic sites, killing civilians, intentionally starving out the population. This is a genocide that is happening. What do I think is going to happen there? I think unless we can stop Canada and the U.S. from supporting Saudi Arabia, they will destroy most of Yemen and they will take it over. That is what they want to do. If you look at a map, Yemen is right below Saudi Arabia, and there's a port there that they very much want, but essentially...
Hodeidah port?
Yes, which is also has incredible historic sites, which again are being destroyed as we speak. And Saudi Arabia simply wants to take over. And they're using various pretexts, but in any case, unless we stop it, the civilization of Yemen could be destroyed, is a fact. And that is the goal. It is a genocide. Let me make it clear. And it is our taxpayer monies that are funding this. The U.S. has provided logistical support, fueling fighter planes in air, helping with the blockade against this country. And this started under Obama. This is a bipartisan issue, as most of these wars are, by the way. So I'm glad you raised it, and please support the effort against this terrible war. Yes?
Yeah, I think there's one more country that we need to remember, Ukraine. Yeah, what's going on there, and I think from what I last heard, most of the Ukrainians have pretty much had it with the current regime, and they're pretty much like 6% of the population basically we're getting our children as we can, because their glorious party leader, who was 100% not elected by them, of course, has basically gotten to the point where he's got 13-year-olds digging trenches in anticipation of a Russian invasion, which will never happen. Because if the Russians ever actually invade Ukraine right now, it's steamrolled. It is ridiculous. But that's what would happen. If the Russians really wanted to invade Ukraine, they could steamroll them, it'd be over, like that.
Yeah, well, I'll just mention Ukraine briefly. And I do talk about this in my book in detail. The U.S., again, supported a coup in Ukraine in 2014. And we put in power a government that is very closely connected and has within its ranks neo-Nazis. In fact, the former president of Uruguay, Jose Mujica, who they called the poorest president on earth, a really good, humble guy, said it's not really fair to call them neo-Nazis because they date themselves back to the 20s. They're Nazis, period. And these are the people we're backing in Ukraine. And they are also engaged in ethnic cleansing and a possible genocide in the Donbass region of Ukraine, where the ethnic Russians live. And again, if there's a place where World War III may start, it could very well be Ukraine. And again, it's not something you see in the news.
It's not a possible genocide. Poroshenko has, on multiple occasions, openly stated his intention to have their kids hiding in bomb shelters.
Yes.
He's said that.
Yeah.
Just a little brief note to respond to an earlier question. There was a question about the arms shipments to Venezuela and via aircraft, and if there was more detail on that. If you're curious about that, there's a number of articles. One of them is on a site called Mint Press News, and it's in this case, by Whitney Webb, and the headline is called U.S. Air Freight Company That Smuggled Weapons into Venezuela Linked to CIA Black Site Renditions. In other words, they were using one of their torture planes to move weapons. into Venezuela. One of their rendition aircraft that they put people into Guantanamo Bay and stuff was also being used to ship small arms into Venezuela.
Yes.
Are there any voices of sanity in the U.S. Congress? How much opposition is there?
There's one real, yeah, well, it's a great question. There's not many. The one person who's going to run for president in 2020 who will have my vote is Hawaiian Representative Tulsi Gabbard, who's incredible, brave. It's amazing, though. These issues are verboten. I mean, the irony, of course, is that the one person who kind of talked about him during his campaign was Trump. Like, Trump did talk about some of these truths. He talked about the U.S. support for ISIS and Al-Qaeda. He said that these wars were ridiculous. You know, it doesn't seem to have changed his policies, but he's one of the few people who actually were at least was honest about it. But generally, I mean, these things cannot be spoken of. And the weird part, of course, for example, with the regime change operations in Venezuela, is that Democrats who generally think Trump's an idiot, probably true, and who think, you know, he's not a nice guy, probably true, are supporting him and John Bolton and Elliott Abrams to overthrow a government in Venezuela. All of a sudden, he's a smart guy. It's really bizarre, but there is largely bipartisan support. But I think the only way to get more voices like those of Tulsi Gabbard or folks here in Canada is for us to be on the streets and us to push.
That's the only way. Yes.
To push for those voices to be heard and to be seen. We're the only ones who can stop these wars. Let's be clear. And in a way, and let me be clear, like, because I know people can leave meetings like this depressed, and we have a privilege. Yeah, we could have grown up in Luxembourg. There's not much we could do from there. We grew up in North America. We are the belly of the beast, as Che Guevara said. We can make change. If we change our countries, we can change the world. That's a fact. And we must do it. But that's a privilege we have. And so let's use that privilege and let's try to do that. Yes?
Yeah, we were talking earlier about that stage video in Syria. When the Americans won the war in Iraq, or when they thought they won the war, the residents walked down the main street, mostly young men, celebrating the U.S. winning, and then they tore down that statue. To me, that looked staged, like they were hired guns or whatever you want to call them to make it look like they're supporting the Americans winning that war.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that's true, but I wouldn't doubt it. You know, I mean, of course, we know that certainly the whole reasons for the war were staged, the lies about weapons of mass destruction, again, the yellow cake speech, which turned out not to be true. And again, the media went right along with all of it. I'll note one other great act of propaganda, which is very recent regarding Venezuela. So you might have seen this in the CBC, sheepishly had to retract the story. CBC, along with a number of other media outlets, showed a photo of a bridge that crosses Colombia into Venezuela, and it showed semis on it. And it said, Maduro has blocked this bridge to stop humanitarian aid. It turned out that bridge hasn't been used for years. That bridge has been down for years. Had nothing to do with this. And yet this was put out as truth. And there was very little apology given for trying to mislead people. Yes?
Henry Evans, just there was a report out recently that Trump wanted to privatize the military and bring in Blackwater. What do you know about that?
Yeah, well, that certainly is a possibility. Incredible Blackwater, which, as we know, committed war crimes in Iraq, has been somehow rehabilitated. They now have a new company called ZZI, I think is what it's called. And yeah, there certainly seems to be plans to leave Afghanistan, but to leave, a private military force. And I think you may start seeing that more and more, is us contracting out our wars in ways which make it even...
in Venezuela as well?
I don't know that, but I wouldn't be surprised. I know in Colombia for years there were like 6 private military contractors operating in Colombia. So I have no doubt that if it comes to it, that there'll be some operating in Venezuela. So I was told 2 more questions. Okay.
Yeah, on the topic of Afghanistan, it's a good time, by the way. I heard that there was recently a statement released, I looked at it myself, by the commander of the U.S. forces there, who pretty much openly said that we have no chance of winning here. The guy literally came out and said, we have no chance of winning in Afghanistan because everybody hates us, pretty much is what it came down to.
Yeah, well, I think that's clear. We've been there 18 years. I mean, as someone said, if the Afghanistan war was a person, they'd be able to vote by now.
Yeah.
And of course, let's just remind ourselves who we're fighting: the Taliban that grew out of the Mujahideen, which the U.S. created to fight the Soviets. And then when the Soviets invaded, we said, oh, that's so terrible. And then we boycotted the Olympics in 1980. We're now fighting the very war the Soviets were fighting. You realize that? Against the very same people. It's an irony, a horrible, terrible irony. But in the end, yes, the Taliban will win. And that's why people don't want us to leave, because it will just show how futile this violent escapade has been there. That we will leave, and the people who, again, we put in power, and who we now don't like or pretending not to like, they're going to be in power anyway. So it's an incredible thing. $6 trillion later, and we will have nothing to show for it.
Yeah, plus the terrain there is just like perfect for insurgencies.
Oh, yeah? Yes?
Dan, from where do you get the strength, the hope, to keep talking about these issues that, as you said very well, they are really depressing?
Right.
And I tell you, just 1 minute, because I came from Chile in 1974.
I thought you were Chilean. I guessed that. Okay.
And so what is going on in Venezuela right now, I live that. Exactly. I live it. But still I have a real good hope that the people are the ones that are going at the end to decide what is going to happen in Venezuela. The people in Venezuela are going to decide that. But for you personally, how do you keep going? Because for me, it's looking an empire like the dark side of the empire, overwhelming in power, so much power that I would say, what we can do? We have nothing. What can we do?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, empires do fall. We know this. But I think the key to do this type of work is you cannot, be results-oriented. That is to say, you have to enjoy the struggle, because we may not win it. I know that. I'm not Pollyannish about these things, right? But I know the fight is right. I know I'm on the right side. And that gives me hope. I enjoy fighting the good fight. And if I die doing it, and I die losing it, I fought the good fight. And Thomas Merton, who was the monk who became a peace activist, he wrote a letter to a young activist, and he said, a lot of times you're going to feel like what you do is futile, because you're going to feel you can't change the world. He says, but you know what? It's the people you meet along the way that will give you hope and will give you joy. And that's how I feel, meeting people like you, meeting people in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, this tiny, tiny country that overthrew a U.S.-backed dictator, that defeated the Contras, that came back, the second poorest country in the hemisphere. They have 6 million people. They have no right to win against the United States, and yet they have. They are the David who has slain Goliath. To stand with those people, to be with those people, to feel love from those people because you're on their side, there's nothing like it. Nothing like it. And every day I get up and I remember being in Nicaragua in the 80s during the Contra War. And I remember realizing my country was on the wrong side of the world struggle. And I said then, I was 19, I said, I will live the rest of my life fighting this. And every day I wake up And I remember that, and every day I wake up and do something. One thing, one step forward to fight my country in its attempt to run this world. And that gives me joy. And I think it was Galliano who said that the duty of a revolutionary is to be joyful. And I live that. That is the way to be. Yes?
Yeah! I think it must be pointed out that there's also a significant amount of trouble brewing inside the state itself. Like, for example, the recent real estate wars, I believe they're being termed, where pretty much people are sick and tired of living at the whim of the mercy of the government. And because the power bills and whatnot keep going up, and then, but what they're being paid doesn't keep going up, so they can't, so what they're doing is, you got lots of people who are going off-grid, who are buying inexpensive patches of land, and they're basically going all self-made,
Okay, I'm going to have to stop you there because we can't do the back and forth question period is ending, but if you want to ask more from Dan about that, we should be able to know what media outlets we can find Dan Kovalik writing for. So what media outlets are you typically found in?
I write for Counterpunch quite a bit. I do some stuff on Telesur. RT interviews me a lot, Press TV. Things that I like, that I go to, are those things, but also I think Global Research, which is based in Canada, is very good. Consortium News is very good. Mint Press, you mentioned, often has some great stuff. People's Voice here in Canada is very good. Also has been very supportive of me and my books, so I'm very grateful for that. Those are things that at least for starters, are good places to check out. So.
Thanks, and you can follow Dan on Facebook as well. So I want to thank everyone for attending. You can sign up for the email list for the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, and of course you'll get updates on other things like the radio program, Unusual Sources here in Hamilton. So if you want to join the executive, there are spots open. You can talk to myself. You can talk to any of the executive members you've seen up here today. So thanks very much, and hope to see you at the next event, including tomorrow at the Hamilton Palestine Film Festival. Thank you.